Last time I suggested something strange. What if consciousness isn't produced by matter? What if matter sometimes only provides the conditions under which consciousness can remain stable? But before we can even evaluate an idea like that, we need to ask a more basic question. Why do we assume consciousness is produced by matter in the first place? And at first, the answer seems very obvious. We are made from matter, and we are conscious. Everything we know about ourselves points towards matter, because our brains exist and neurons fire. And while the state of our brain changes, our behavior changes. And so far, we have been remarkably successful at explaining those relationships. In fact, there is a good reason why most researchers focus on behavior rather than experience. Because behavior can be measured. Experience cannot. At least not directly. Science can observe what a system does, but it cannot step inside that system and observe what it feels like to be it. But that creates a subtle problem, because two completely different systems can sometimes produce the same behavior. Imagine a small robot dog, a children's toy. Whenever a sensor in its eye detects movement, it barks. The mechanism is simple, nothing mysterious. Nobody looks at this toy and wonders whether it's having an inner life. Not me, at least. Now imagine we start improving it. We add more sensors, more responses, more behaviors. When it sees its owner, it wags its tail. When it sees a bone, it begins to beg. When it encounters another dog, it sniffs its butt. We keep adding rules. More and more. Until eventually something strange happens. From the outside, the robot becomes indistinguishable from a real dog. Because every behavior matches, every reaction matches, every observable detail matches. At this point, should we assume the robot is conscious? Most people would say no. And that answer is interesting. Because if behavior were all that mattered, we would have no reason to distinguish the robot from the dog. Yet, almost everyone does, intuitively. We feel that something is missing. The robot behaves correctly, but there is no reason to think anything is happening behind the behavior. No reason to think that somewhere on the way the toy developed an own perspective. And this is where the real question appears. What exactly is the difference between robot and the dog? Of course not the behavior. But where does experience enter the picture? Is there a mechanism that could create it? Is there a function that should produce it? Because if we cannot point to such a function, we seem to face an uncomfortable choice. Either experience is somehow present far more broadly than we usually assume, or behavior alone is insufficient to explain why conscious experience exists at all. And of course, this is neither about robots or dogs. This is about you and me. Because I can ask the same question about myself. Could a version of me exist that behaves exactly as I do now, while experiencing nothing? Could it make videos? Answer questions? Drink coffee? Discuss philosophy? Perhaps. At least nothing in the behavioral description seems to rule that out. And yet, there is one fact I can hardly ignore. I am experiencing something. Not as a theory, not as a conclusion, but as the most immediate fact available to me. And once that observation enters the picture, something becomes difficult to dismiss. Maybe the problem is not merely that we have not yet explained consciousness. Perhaps the problem is that our explanations seem to describe everything around consciousness, while never quite reaching consciousness itself. The behavior, the mechanisms, the structure, the processing. But nothing of this needs an experience. And maybe the gap will eventually disappear. Maybe we are still missing a crucial insight. But until then, I think it deserves to be taken more seriously. Because if experience is real, and I find it difficult to doubt that it is, then understanding reality may require more than simply describing what systems do. It may require us to understand why some systems seem conscious, while others do not. The question I'm really trying to ask is, if we continue to fail at identifying the exact process that turns electrical signals into colors, emotions, thoughts, and subjective experience, then at what point does it become reasonable to ask whether consciousness was never produced in the first place? At what point does it become reasonable to ask whether consciousness is a fundamental part of reality itself? And that is where we continue next time. Auf Wiedersehen.